Hi everyone, happy weekend. Corie here, and it's time to recap all of our assigned reading from the Bible Discovery Guide, or if you're following along in your Bibles with Bible Discovery TV. If you want to know more about the ministry of me and my family, check out the description box below. Today, we are going to be recapping several chapters from the Old Testament, and several intense chapters at that. We're going to be looking at Ezekiel 40 to Daniel chapter 9. So, prophecy. We're in a lot of prophecy today. Let's just jump right in. Ezekiel chapter 40. Okay, so this is dated for us by the prophet Ezekiel to the 25th year of that original wave of exiles. Because remember that the Babylonian exile of Judah happened in a few different waves. So before the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, there was a first wave of exiles that Ezekiel and Daniel and King Jehoiachin were all a part of. There was a lot of nobles and a lot of more of the upper class society and royals of Judah and Jerusalem that were taken. So 25 years after that exile, this group of people had been exiled. It's also 14 years after the fall of Jerusalem. So that second wave of exiles has already happened. And I can't remember the exact date for that third wave of exiles, but that one has probably already happened as well. So in this year, the 25th year of exile, 14th year after the destruction of Jerusalem, Ezekiel gets this vision. He gets a vision of Jerusalem that right at that moment, when he's alive, it's in ruins, right? So he gets this vision of a completed Jerusalem, finished. The temple is there. So he sees the wall around the temple area and all of its gates of this temple complex. A man whom Ezekiel describes as having an appearance like that of bronze, so not any ordinary man, clearly some sort of angelic, spiritual, heavenly being. At this point, he goes around measuring everything in the temple and telling Ezekiel the measurements of what's going on. There's some really interesting details in here, like the gates of the temple, their doorways, the posts, the beams of the gateways are decorated with palm trees. We're told that there are rooms that he gets to see that are used for sacrificial preparations. So there's washing, utensils and basins, and there's tables for slaughtering the animals, and there's all sorts of utensils for these sacrificial purposes. We're also told that there's two priestly rooms, one for the priests who are tasked with guarding the temple, and another room for the priests who are actually guarding the altar. So they're taking care of the actual sacrifices and things of that nature. And it's specifically mentioned that those are the descendants of Zadok. And we're going to talk about him a little bit more as we continue on. Okay, Ezekiel chapter 41, this measuring continues, but this time it's measuring the temple, not just the wall and the rooms within the walls of the Temple Mount, but this time it's the actual temple that's being measured. In Ezekiel chapter 42, there's measuring of the priest's rooms. So there's these storage rooms for storing things like the grain offering and the wine offering and the produce offering, things like that. And then there's also dressing rooms for the priests, because they have to leave their linen clothes there. They come into work, they change there, they go to work at the Temple Mount, and then they leave the clothes there and go back to their street clothes when they go to leave. So all of these measurements can be really easy to get bogged down into, especially when you don't have a picture to go on, right? It's just these, and the wall was this much, and the door was this much, and the lintel was this much. But the idea behind this for Ezekiel, when you put your mind in the mind of an exile who's been exiled for so long and has lived through the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, is that this will be restored. It's ruins right now. But by going through every minute detail with Ezekiel and giving him the physical measurements, this is tangible evidence for Ezekiel that there will be a restoration of the temple. All right, Ezekiel chapter 43, still in the same vision. God's presence comes back to the temple from the east. Do you remember a few weeks ago we were talking about how God's presence left the temple, signaling that it was going to be destroyed, that it had been decommissioned? Well, now in this vision, Ezekiel sees God's presence come back into the temple from the east, and it's this chariot throne of God back from Ezekiel chapter 1 that he describes so vividly, and I think chapter 4 as well, if my memory is serving me. So the chariot throne of God comes from the east, possibly the Mount of Olives, through the east gate of the Temple Mount and back into the temple. So I wanted to read you verse 7. He said, "Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place for the soles of my feet. This is where I will live among the Israelites forever. The people of Israel will never again defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their prostitution and the funeral offerings for their kings at their death." Okay, so there's two things there. That prostitution doesn't refer just to a physical act of human sexuality, of prostitution. Prostitution in all of the prophets has been used, and here in Ezekiel as well, has been used to talk about the idolatry of Israel, because Israel, as God's covenant people, were symbolized in kind of like this marriage relationship with God. That's the analogy that's being used, remember, from last week? And so Israel going after idols and going after foreign people groups as alliances, that's all seen as adultery, and even prostitution. It crossed the line into prostitution as well. So that's what's being talked about here. And interesting, God brings up the honoring of the kings by fire, funeral fires, where they would burn these spices to honor the memory of the king. But that somewhere along the line crossed the line from just being like a nice thing to do to, no, this is turning into, you're not honoring God as much as you're honoring your physical kings. So that's a problem. So the very end of Ezekiel chapter 43, the altar is restored as well, and animal sacrifices are reinstituted in a pure way. So back to the Mosaic covenant and the law of God. Ezekiel chapter 44. This is all about the priesthood being restored. So you see what I mean here? There's all restoration in these final chapters of Ezekiel. So this chapter is all about the priesthood being restored. They're told to shut the eastern gate because God went through it. So it's now kind of a holy symbol. And the only person who's allowed to go to that gate and go through the gate is the prince. And the king, and when he offers his Sabbath sacrifices or his free will offerings to God, he's allowed to eat it in that gate in the presence of God. And there's this message to the people to put away their evil. And that's meant to be in light of the potential of restoration. When your future could look like this, like the restoration of the pure religion of Israel, why would you want to hold on to your sinful ways? That's kind of the message that's going on here in Ezekiel chapter 44. Descendants of Zadok, like I said before, are singled out here in chapter 44 as the only acceptable high priests, because during the time period of the kings, they were really the only ones who stayed faithful to God and who are mourning over the idolatrous practices that were going on. Ezekiel chapter 45. This is all about the restoration of Israel, as in the land of Israel, the whole country. So it talks about how the tribes of Israel will be allowed to live in the land, and that the princes or the kings of Israel will not take too much from the people. They're not going to oppress the people. So there's going to be a true balance there can be a true balance of life to the land of Israel, where the blessings get to be enjoyed by the people without having to be subject to the whims of some prince or some king. Okay, Ezekiel chapter 46. So this is all about the prince going through the east gate. It talks about how every Sabbath he's supposed to worship there, and whenever he wants to do his free will offering, that's also outlined here in chapter 46. And again, these images are all about what could be if the people of God chose to follow God. Ezekiel chapter 47. There's only 2 more chapters here in Ezekiel. This one's really interesting. This one talks about, in chapter 47, I think I said that. It talks about a river flowing from underneath the temple. And how as it flows away from the temple, it gets very deep and very wide. Very deep and very wide. And it flows into the Dead Sea, which that's a landmark today. We know where that is. And of course, it's dead. Nothing lives in there. It's way too salty. If you ever get a chance to swim in it, absolutely do it. So when this river from the temple, this freshwater river, connects with the Dead Sea, in that zone where the fresh water and the salt water is mixing, there's going to be so much fresh water that it makes that place habitable for fish, and it's going to be overflowing with fish. Also, the boundaries of the border, I should say, of the land of Israel are outlined here in 47. Okay, final chapter, Ezekiel 48, final chapter in Ezekiel. The division of the land by tribe is given. So again, this is going back to the tribal allotments, back in Deuteronomy and Joshua. And then the gates of Jerusalem, the actual physical city, it's mentioned that they're going to be named after the 12 tribes of Israel, which is pretty cool. So restoration, the final several chapters of Ezekiel are all about how restoration is possible for Israel. Okay, Daniel, what a book. Daniel, again, was one of those first waves of exiles. And we're told here in Daniel chapter 1, Daniel's exile is actually described for us, how he was taken as part of the royal or noble class of Jerusalem, and he was chosen to be trained to serve in Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon's court. This was kind of a thing that the kings of Babylon did with their exiles. It was a way to get the exiles involved, but it was also kind of a flex, a power flex for these kings. I control so much land that my court is multicultural, right? Okay, so they trained for 3 years to learn the Babylonian ways. They would have to learn languages. They would have to learn, their writing and their history and their politics and their society and their religion. All of these things they would have to learn. So 4 of these men are named. We've got Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are better known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because of a chapter that is coming up. Okay, so these men, we get to see their struggle here in Daniel chapter 1. They're faithful to God, and they want to stay faithful to God even in the punishment of their exile. So they understand that they're being punished, that all of Judah is being punished for their unfaithfulness. But they still want to try to find a way to accept their punishment, but still follow God, still be orthodox with their beliefs. And so when their diet is rolled out, all of the food that's given to them, which is the choice food of the land, it would be the best of the best, the most expensive of everything you could get. The problem is it was offered to idols first, and then they ate it on behalf of the idols. So it was a part of the Babylonian religion, and they didn't want any part of that. So they strike up a deal that they'll only eat vegetables and water that isn't offered to the idols, and just test it out. Just see if we are able to maintain our body weight and our pleasant physical appearance. Because, in societies where pretty much any society other than the West, when survival is of key importance and getting enough calories is of key importance, a little bit of chubbiness is a really good thing. It's a sign of status. It's a sign of wealth. It's a sign of abundance. And that's what was wanted in Nebuchadnezzar's court. So they needed, miraculously, on just a diet of vegetables and water, they still looked chubby and healthy. Good to go. It was a miracle. And it's also told how these 4 men excelled and they surpassed the wisdom and the knowledge of all the other wise men, and they really impressed King Nebuchadnezzar, so they were a part of his court after those 3 years. Daniel chapter 2, this records King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So Nebuchadnezzar seems like a really ornery, interesting sort of a guy, not just from the Bible, definitely from the Bible, but also from the historical records that we have of him. He had a dream, and he knew his dream had a meaning, but he did not want to just tell the wise men his dream. He wanted to test these wise men. Maybe he was annoyed at them. Maybe they had gotten under his skin for something. We don't really know the reason why, but he got it in his head. If you're so wise, you can tell me what I dreamed. If you have some sort of spiritual knowledge, then you should be able to tell me. And of course, no one can. So Nebuchadnezzar says, well, I'm going to kill you all, and I'm going to destroy your homes, which maybe this means the destruction of their homes. Maybe that's representative of ending their profession in Babylon, right? There's no one to inherit their homes and become more wise men. Just a thought. So Daniel gets his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, to pray to God, and that night, asking for mercy. And that night, God gives Daniel an interpretation of the dream and what the dream was. So Daniel tells the king, and the dream is this. He saw a statue made of different materials, and different body sections were different materials. So, for example, the statue's head was made out of gold, and that was representative of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire, which I'm sure Nebuchadnezzar must have loved that he was the head of gold, right, on this statue. So every subsequent body part underneath the head represented a different kingdom that would take over, that would inherit that power from the Babylonian Empire. And because of this dream interpretation, it was bang on, and Daniel was made the ruler of the province of Babylon. Okay, Daniel chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar makes an image, an idol of gold for everyone to worship in the empire as a test of loyalty to him, to the empire. And of course, if you don't do it, you die, because you're either loyal or you're a traitor, and traitors deserve to die, right? So this is the whole idea. So this chapter is what made Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah's Babylonian names the most famous, because they're only referred to here as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel's not mentioned for whatever reason in this chapter. It's a bit of a mystery, but he's not in there. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego end up being thrown into a fiery furnace at the wrath of King Nebuchadnezzar, who can't believe that even after he gives them a second chance to bow before this statue, just bow. He's polytheistic, right? He believes in many gods. So what's the harm in just bowing before this idol? So he sees it probably as a personal assault against his intelligence, against his leadership, the whole shebang. He gets incensed and he throws them into the furnace that's been pumped up 7 times. So that just means like as hot as it could possibly get. And of course, they don't burn. And in fact, when Nebuchadnezzar looks inside the furnace, he can see them walking around, and he sees what he describes as someone who looks like a son of God. So someone who looks like a spiritual being in there walking with them. And as a result of this, he calls them out of the furnace, and probably a little bit afraid, promotes them to higher positions within his kingdom, within his court. Daniel chapter 4. This is a confession of Nebuchadnezzar written in the Bible, basically to the whole empire, that he had a dream and that Daniel interpreted it, and it resulted in his humbling, his humiliation, Nebuchadnezzar's humiliation. So the dream was that he saw this enormous tree that was as tall as the heavens and wide and beautiful, and it provided food and shelter for every creature. But then all of a sudden it was stripped bare down to just a stump. And the interpretation is that Nebuchadnezzar is this amazing provider, but he's so proud, he would go insane and behave like a wild animal until he was willing to acknowledge that it wasn't his greatness that got him to the position that he was in, but it was actually God's sovereignty, that God allowed this to happen, that God wanted this to happen for the correction of his people. Until he's willing to say, how Daniel puts it, heaven rules. So not you, Nebuchadnezzar, but there's a deeper spiritual truth that's going on here. We also learn in this chapter that Daniel's Babylonian name was Belshazzar, which is interesting. Daniel advises Nebuchadnezzar to repent of his sin, and none of this would happen, but of course he doesn't. And a year later, the prophecy comes true. Nebuchadnezzar goes mad and begins acting like an animal until he acknowledges that God is sovereign and he is restored. Okay, Daniel chapter 5 skips down to the very end of the Babylonian Empire. So Nebuchadnezzar's no more at this point. This is the Neo-Babylonian Empire, I should say. Nebuchadnezzar's no more, and we have King Belshazzar, a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. He's feasting, he's giving a big banquet, and historically we know that his reign wasn't going very well. He was actually rapidly losing power, and he was in a war with Media Persia. So, Belshazzar has the cups that Nebuchadnezzar looted from the temple of God, and he drinks. He's having this big party. And so he brings out these ritualistic chalices, and they begin just drinking wine from them and beer and whatever. And a hand appears and writes a message on the wall, and when the wise men don't know what it says, the queen remembers Daniel, and they bring out this really old Daniel, and Daniel chastises Belshazzar right away, and he goes, you know how God humbled Nebuchadnezzar. You know that he acted crazy for several years until he acknowledged God's sovereignty, and yet it hasn't influenced you at all, you foolish king. So then the message on the wall essentially says, you've been weighed, you've been measured, and you have been found wanting. Your kingdom is going to be handed over to the Medes and the Persians. And historically we know that during that big festival night, the Media-Persian Empire did take over, and they walked into Babylon basically without a fight. Daniel chapter 6. Darius, the new ruler of Babylon, because Babylon has now fallen to the Media-Persian Empire, he keeps Daniel on as one of his governors, and Daniel is very successful, and Darius really likes him, and this makes the other governors really jealous, but they can't find fault with Daniel. They're trying to get him out of the picture, erased, whacked, gone, but they can't. So they entice Darius to make a rule that says no one's able to pray to anyone but the king for 30 days. It's probably supposed to be a big morale booster, knowing that Daniel won't do it. So when Daniel still prays, they report him, and then the king has no choice but to punish him with the set punishment, which is being thrown into a den of lions. The king's really upset by this, but Daniel's not so much. And of course, you know the story. God shuts the mouths of the lions. Daniel survives the night. And when the king takes Daniel out of the pit, he has those governors who reported Daniel and their families thrown into the lion's den, and they are eaten by the lions. That's the part that all of the Sunday school lessons leave out of Daniel in the lion's den, but the Bible doesn't. Daniel chapter 7. Okay, this skips back now to the time of Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, that last king of Babylon. Daniel had a dream during his reign of 4 beasts. The first beast was a lion with the wings of an eagle, and these wings were torn off, and the lion kind of morphs and stands up on 2 feet like a human, and a human mind is given to this beast. The second beast is a bear that has 3 ribs in its mouth, like it's chewing on these 3 ribs, and it was told to get up and eat your fill of flesh. The third beast was a leopard with 4 wings on its back, with 4 heads, and it was given the authority to rule. And the fourth beast had large iron teeth, so it's kind of mechanical at this point. It crushed and devoured its victims, and it said that anyone that didn't die from crushing or like chewing was trampled by it. It had 10 horns, and this beast it's said to be different from all the other 3 beasts. So while Daniel was watching the 10 horns of this last beast, it said that a little horn comes up among the 10 horns and starts boasting. And then it kind of morphs to God taking his place in this judgment court, I guess you would say. So God takes his throne, and this beast was slain and thrown into the fire. But the other three beasts were allowed to live on a little while longer. There's this Son of Man figure that's given authority, that's given sovereign power, so like God's power and glory, and his kingdom lasts forever, and he was worshipped by all. So this is the Messiah. This is Jesus Christ. And in terms of interpreting this dream for you, what I'm going to say is only this, that the beasts represent kingdoms that would rise on earth, or that will rise on earth. And the fourth is the most fierce, but it will be destroyed by God first and thrown into the fire. So if you have questions, I can do my best, but honestly, guys, prophecy, especially when related to end times prophecy, is not my forte. So I might be able to point you in a few directions, but it's not something that I have chosen to focus on in my ministry as of yet. Okay, Daniel chapter 8. This is a vision that Daniel had. In the vision, Daniel was in the citadel of Susa. So Susa was a Persian capital city, one of the Persian capital cities. And he's beside this man-made canal, a waterway, and he sees a ram. You're going to notice that empires and countries and kingdoms are represented a lot by things like beasts and animals and even statues. But here we go. Daniel sees a ram with two long horns, and one horn is longer than the other horn, but the other horn eventually grows up as well. This ram conquered the west, the north, and the south, and no one could stand against the ram. Then he sees a goat with a horn right between its eyes that came quickly from the west and defeats the ram. And at the height of the goat's power, its horn was actually broken off, and 4 other horns grow up and take its place. Out of one of these 4 horns, another horn starts growing, and it starts growing toward the land of Israel, and it goes really badly. This little horn sets itself up to be as great as the commander of the Lord's army. It takes away the daily sacrifices. It sets up an abomination in the temple. It's just a terrible thing. So here's the interpretation that's given for us. It's the interpretation that's given in the Bible, but also a historical interpretation put onto the Bible as well. So that's your disclaimer here. So it's believed that the ram with the 2 horns that he saw first is the Media-Persian Empire. So the 2 horns represent Media and Persia. And at first, Persia is of little significance, but pretty soon it grows and grows and grows past the Median Empire. The goat that defeats the Media-Persian Empire is Greece, and the horn in the middle of its eyes represents the leadership of Alexander the Great, who died young, so it was broken off, and his leadership was taken over by 4 of his army commanders, so those 4 horns on the goat's head. And the one little horn that grows off of one of the 4 horns towards Israel and creates all sorts of havoc for the people of God in the land should probably be seen as Antiochus Epiphanes. I always say that wrong. Forgive me, but during the intertestamental time period, so between the closing of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, that's when this history actually happened. He desecrated the temple, and that led to what we remember today as the Maccabean Revolt, and the miracle of the lights in the temple lasting, which is celebrated today, of course, continuously since that time as Hanukkah. That is a very quick summary of that. I want to then move on to Daniel chapter 9, our final chapter. So Daniel, during the Persian king's reigns, he knows from reading Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, that the exile will last for 70 years. So he begins repenting for himself, for the people, and praying for God's mercy and restoration. And the angel Gabriel comes to him and gives him this elaborate prophecy. It's short, but so elaborate. We refer to it today as Daniel's 70 sevens. And there are a series of weeks and years of sevens that anticipate the coming of the Messiah, the rebuilding of the temple, the killing of the Messiah, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, more wars, more covenants, and then finally this ominous abomination of desolation. Now, I am not going to get into the interpretation of that. It can just really get us bogged down into the weeds, but it is a really interesting chapter to read if you are at all interested in historical prophecy and even future prophecy. All right, guys, I know this was a heavy one. Comment down below, question down below. I was on vacation last week through the weekend. My family and I were able to escape to a little cottage that we Airbnb'd, and it was so nice. So that's how my week went. I'm coming off of a vacation with my family, my 2 little boys and my husband. How was your week? How was your weekend? How is it going? How's your Bible reading going? Are you keeping up? Do you like biblical prophecy, or is this a hard section of scripture for you? This used to be a really hard section of scripture for me, but I'm coming around to it. All right. As always, comment below. I'll talk to you in those comments, and I hope you have a good week.